thank you, Ron Mitchell and the Bay State Banner Art Gallery, for bringing us this exciting series that highlights local artists, brought to you in hard copy and online. I am your interviewer, Lamerchi Frazier. Words like humanitarian, historian, documentation, visual activist, word builder, significant come to mind when I think of the words that describe, say, Shea justice. I am very much privileged to have the opportunity to interview for the Banner our artist of focus, Shea Justice, to give and shed some light on his work. And as his name implies, his work broadly and intensely is situated to recognize the realm of social justice. We want to know, aside from the call of your name, Shea, what motivates you? What powerful forces drive your work? What are your influences that gave birth to these superb representational drawings and assemblages? Works that shed light on extraordinarily high-profile and ordinary people. We are pleased that your investment in the history results in art as document, and that you are here today to discuss that with us. Welcome, Shea.
Thank you so much for having me. Been a fan of the Bay State Banner since I was a kid, so it's an honor just to be interviewed for the newspaper and for the video. So I want to start with that.
Yes, it is our honor to have you. So tell us more about where you come from as a Roxbury native, and what have been some of your influences in the world as you made the decision to become the prolific artist and visual historical documentarian that you've become.
Okay, because that's a lot to unpack, so I'll go step by step with it.
Okay.
I grew up in Roxbury, Massachusetts. I got into art at a really, really early age because there used to be a TV show that used to come on Saturday mornings called Drawing from Nature with Captain Bob Cottle. This was before Bob Ross. I told my students, this is way before Bob Ross. It was Captain Bob.
Wow.
And at the end of each show, he would say, let's draw a horseshoe crab, or let's draw certain animals or certain things. And at the end of the show, he would have the camera pan across the stage to show artwork from people who sent stuff in. So I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I had learned how to write my name and address, not my name, but my address and everything on envelopes, where to place them and where to put the stamp. And I sent something in, and they actually had it on the show.
Oh.
But at the time, I wanted to wake my mom up about it, but I couldn't because when they pan it, it takes like 2 seconds or whatever, a few seconds. But I was so excited about it that it just made me go, I'm going to always do this. I had a next door neighbor named Wendell Sullivan who was a big influence on me because he also used to draw superheroes all the time when we used to trade the drawings around because he was so good. And then at a certain point, I was like, well, I want to try to draw the Hulk and Spider-Man too. And before you know it, I was like, wow, I'm really where he's at. And he was a few years older than me.
Yes. You mentioned that you showed it to your mom, and I noticed that on your shirt you have a button of a woman. Can you tell us more about how that might have been one of your major influences in your life?
The woman is high school yearbook photo of my mother, and she passed away earlier this summer. And so I always I've been telling myself when I talk, like I had a show at Fountain Street Gallery last year, and I made it a point to talk about how big of an influence my mother has always been on me. So in doing this interview, I wanted to make sure that my mother, Eleanor Justice, looking down here, knows I'm still going to represent.
That's wonderful.
So that's why I said, I got to have this when I talk about my own career and what's happened as an artist.
Okay, so now that you've shared some of that memory, how has your involvement in memory, metaphor, and history manifested in your life work, your art practice?
I think me and my older brother, Sean, God rest his soul, but my older brother, Sean, when we were kids, as we were growing up, we both had pretty much like eidetic memories of things that happened in school or family functions or get-togethers or things we noticed and stuff like that. And I think that I started writing it down or drawing it or taking notes. And when we used to visit my grandparents in Harrisonburg, Virginia, my grandparents were antique collectors. And one of the things that always stood out for me when you first walked into my grandmother's house was this this display box that you could turn around in circles, and on the display boxes were political buttons of candidates, Dwight Eisenhower, Spiro Agnew, Richard Nixon, the Kennedys, and I remember being like 5 or 6 trying to memorize those names because I was curious about who they were. And again, this was when Jimmy Carter was president, so this was way back when. But I used to be fascinated by the antique things my grandparents had in the house, and it inspired me to collect a lot of things on my own, but it also got me more motivated in terms of drawing. Yes.
Okay, so as we think about the work that you're doing and the work that you're really recognized for right now are your acclaimed scrolls. And as you prolifically document history in this lengthy record that goes for centuries,
Down the street, yeah.
down the street for miles. I'd like you to tell us more about that, how you got started. I have one, in fact, here in my hand that just goes and is replete with images and text, and it's a very fascinating way for us to experience history. But how did you get started? What is this all about for you?
Okay, so we got a lot to unpack, but I'm glad to do it. I got into political art when I was growing up, partly seeing Mel King's campaign for mayor. My mom was one of the volunteer workers, her and my Aunt Jane. Seeing the murals that Dana Chandler did all up and down Roxbury, and because I grew up partly in Grove Hall, so I'd see them right across the street and right down Dudley. And just the beauty and the strength in Dana's work. Then years later, I got to meet him and see a lot of the political things he's been doing that I was like, oh, this is very inspirational. When I was 16, from my school newspaper, this is when I went to English High, I got to give a shout out to my high school. I got an opportunity to interview former President Gerald Ford for the school newspaper.
Wow.
And it just triggered something in me that I just loved it. And then when I went to college, I went to BU, I wanted to be an illustrator or possibly a comic book artist and drawing superheroes and things like that. But I started to lose interest in doing that because I took an African American studies class with Floyd Barber, who was one of the best teachers I've ever had in my life. And there's so many of us who have so many stories about our reality and our experiences. For instance, Paul Robeson. You almost have to invent someone as brilliant as Paul Robeson, to the point where Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, it got less and less interesting, and I was like, we have so many stories of us that are not known. And it's kind of frustrating sometimes when you have people who say, I didn't know that. No one told me that. Well, you got to have due diligence and do the research, especially in places like Florida where they're trying to block education from even discussing our history. Now, in answer to your question regarding what got me started on the Scroll Project, when you're in college, they make you buy stuff sometimes, at least for art school, that you don't need, right? So this is when I went to college. So I had all these rolls of paper. I had about 7 of them. And at the high school I teach at, Lincoln Sudbury Regional High School, there was a conservative contingent of students there during the build-up to the Afghan War and the Iraq War. And these conservative students were like ready to argue on campus and pretty much get possibly physical about, you need to support Bush. This is Bush 2. You need to support him. This was leading up to the Afghan War. So randomly, one of the students confronted me and was like, you seem like a liberal. Are you pro-America? Or are you kind of pro the other country? And I was being sarcastic, and I said, I'll tell you what, as the countdown to the invasion happens, I said, I'll take notes and I'll get back to you when I'm done. So the kid was like, yeah, I'd like to see how you're going to deal with it. I had no idea it would be the longest war in American history. Wow. So I've continually worked on it. Once I ran out of paper, one of the artists here actually sold me a really giant roll of it that I've been using since 2008. Just roll it, take notes. But I started in, I think it was 2002, 2003. So I carry it around, wrapped up carefully and all this. Some of the back gets a little bit damaged, so I have to tape certain parts of it to keep it from ripping. And I've been lucky and privileged enough to have some of the people that I've drawn on it actually sign it. And that's been a big deal to me because, again, my mom and my close friends, especially my best friend Joseph Jones, he has been the one to help me consolidate it, roll it up, pack it, and bring it and have certain people sign it. And my mother always says, it's going to be worth money if you can get such and such to sign it. I was like, I'll give a shot at it.
Yes. Well, it seems that there is this over 20-year history that you roll up in these scrolls and have access to public that can appreciate it as an audience. And I just wanted to ask, what in your graphic illustrations drew you to make the images on the scrolls that you do? And where in this running line of history that's in the past and living now and continuous as you keep going with the scrolls, sparks you with what is the principles of democracy, where these intersections of the graphic art and that which is politics and the gestalt that you mentioned, or the worldview, comes into play in your text that you write and in the images that you present?
Well, I started thinking about it in the long term because of the famous saying, can you walk a mile in my shoes? So I said, walk a mile in my views. Let's face it, black men in society and black women in society, people of color in general in society, we often get reduced to sound bites. We don't get reduced to individual human beings and people who have experiences, lives, and reality. So people will just look and say, oh my God, you raised your voice, you're militant. Oh my God, you did this, you're that. You know what I mean? They box black people in. It's unfortunately a part of the American society. So for me, I thought, can you imagine writing, drawing, and illustrating your thoughts and your thought process from 2003, what are we, 2023 now?
Yes.
20 years. If you really want to take the challenge of actually knowing a black person's thought process and what they're observing and their reality, their experience and stuff, number one, I would like to think people realize I'm no different than you. We're both human beings with dreams, aspirations, issues, challenges, concerns. So you can't say that, oh, this is different or you're this way or that way. And I'm like, one of the things I'm adamant about is fact-checking myself to make sure that when someone does read it in its entirety, they're not going to look and go, that's not true, that didn't happen. I'm like, oh, yes, it did. You just don't want to acknowledge it happened.
Yes.
So that's one of the things. And someone asked me, well, when are you going to be done with it? And I said, when I run out of paper. I got a whole thing left. And I'm like, yeah, when I run out of paper, I'll be done.
So should we just keep sending the paper to you for the
No,
rolls?
The roll the part that I've done on this last one that I got is about this full, that's been done. There's about this much that is yet to be done. So I'm thinking I'll be about 63 or something when I'm completely finished with it. Like I wouldn't get a new roll and continue and start, particularly because recently Joe Biden pulled all the troops out of Afghanistan. But the consequences and repercussions of our occupation, you see it with the opioid crisis and the drug crisis in this country. Pharmaceutical companies were all on it because there's so many poppy fields in Afghanistan. All the military hardware that is given to the police departments in the United States that have been used to knock us upside the head. A lot of that was from military subsidized budgets and all these other things through Democrat and Republican presidential administrations. I'm like, oh, I just want to write it down. Let me take notes. Let me get it down. The troops that come home and everyone's upset because they're not getting their fair shake when it comes to mental health issues and physical issues after they've been damaged from IEDs and stuff like that. I'm like, let me write it down. Let's have a conversation afterwards. So when I've explained it to people, they, wow, really? That's what you're going to do? I'm like, oh, yeah, there's a story to be told. But how to display it has been my challenge. Because ideally, from the very beginning all the way to the end, 2-3 miles, in a safe space, everybody doesn't have ink pens so that they can try to write on it and give their alternative opinion and stuff like that. That's ideally what I'd like to do. Something that would engage you all the way until it's over.
So now, looking at your great facility to note what's happening in our present day
Yeah.
and compare it with what was happening in the past as this continuum. Your recent work in an exhibition called History is No Mystery highlights not only your work as an artist, but as a curator. And this exhibition, sponsored by Violence Transformed, happened in a place called Hopkinton, Massachusetts.
It's still up until November 10th.
Okay, it's up still till that time. And when you did this work in that community, featuring images of the Constitution with Frederick Douglass and President Barack Obama and Ida B. Wells in the images, what can you say about how these iconic American flags and documents attributed to the support and the supportive response of that community to your work?
When I gave the artist talk a couple of weeks ago, they were very sweet. They were very supportive, the people that were there. I'm glad, in terms of the materials, like the constitutional series I've been doing and some of the other references, I gotta thank God for the librarians at Lincoln Sudbury Regional High School, where I teach. Every once in a while, they know me well enough to know their back issues of Life magazine, Time magazine, Newsweek, USA. They have it, they always, when I walk in the library, there's usually a sticky note with my name for Shea right there. And I always tell them, you guys are spoiling me, because they know these are the things that he's gonna probably want. I wanted to do a series of pieces about the AR-15, since that's the gun of choice for mass shooters, but we're not capable of actually banning them, no matter who gets killed. And so they looking up stuff for guns and stuff like that to support me and help me with my ideas. So the librarians at Lincoln Sudbury Regional High School, they have been absolutely wonderful. All the references I need. In terms of the constitutional series, I started thinking a few years ago about, when I work, I always keep thinking, in my mind, I keep assuming people aren't gonna wanna know about history, it's boring, it's this and this. What can I do that's going to engage them, but not compromise myself and tailor-make my work in order to appease people? You know what I mean? Like have an opinion that's not going to offend, and have an opinion that's not gonna make people mad.
Right.
But I also wanna do something to engage. And then I started thinking about, what would get a teenager interested in the Constitution? What's that got to do with you? You know what I mean? Kids will say, well, that ain't got nothing to do with me. So I incorporated on the one constitutional piece images of Trayvon Martin and some of these kids that were victims of police brutality, and I wanted to tie it back to the Dred Scott decision that Roger Taney made years ago.
In 1857.
And how it's like it's almost an unwritten thing that whole thing is still, why is it that we still struggle to get justice when it comes to cops? What is qualified immunity? And he's got this giant drawing of Roger Taney with all these young black men who were murdered. What is the connection? And I'm hoping that young people who see that start saying, well, let me at least do the research and then make the connection.
And who is, for our audience, who is Roger Taney?
He was the head of the Supreme Court. He was the leader of the Supreme Court, and they had to make this decision regarding Dred Scott suing to have freedom because he was transported across state lines. His owners wanted him to kind of get some stuff going because they were going to free him anyways. But Roger Taney made the decision, the Negro has no rights that a white man is bound to respect, that we are not citizens. And that was probably the breaking point that led to the Civil War and the country being torn the way it was.
Right. So when we think about why your work matters, you've just given us so much information that goes into the images that you create. And I noticed that as you juxtapose an image to text, what does it matter to you as a black man to have these conversations in your work where there is a divide of very well rendered images with the accompaniment of this text? And how did you arrive in that in your work as a teacher, as a comic book graphic illustrator, as a historian? Can you speak to us about the intersections of all of this that comes together over and over again, symbolically appearing in your work?
Part of it was inspiration from some of Dana Chandler's work, because he's done text with graphic photos from historical stuff that he used to make posters of when he was here at Amar. Another part was I was inspired by Robert Crumb and seeing this film Crumb at the Coolidge Corner Theater years ago. The guy was really popular with underground comics. His work was so racist and misogynistic and sexist and offensive, but it was so brazenly honest that I had to respect that. I mean, he loved jazz and blues music, and he would draw like great black jazz and blues musicians too, so you're like, huh? But he did some really god-awful racist stuff, and it was about his fantasies, his fears, his phobias, and everything. He was like, I don't care who gets offended. And I started thinking, let me do the same thing, or let me consider the same thing. People are always offended when you're black and you're outspoken, or you said you said a little bit too much. That's gonna make them mad and go, see, now you crossed the line. Now you being militant, you angry, and you don't like white people. Mm-hmm. They always try to throw that line in your face at some certain points. And what I like to do is write, draw, unfiltered, don't worry about the consequences of it. You know, make it visually appealing that people may want to see it, but don't worry about the consequences, because you're always gonna have people who hate or feel uncomfortable or unsafe.
So the work that you do is tough stuff. It's how do you describe yourself in this world building of consciousness that I see your work resting in, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But as a historian and artist and teacher, using forms that we not ordinarily are confronted with in art, how do you balance these relevant topics and function in these like universes and landscapes that we not necessarily want to walk on, but through your art we have no choice but to make a decision or to bring some information to what you already have put on the canvas? How do you see yourself with respect to continuing this work?
Well, I'm flattered that you say historian, because I don't consider myself a historian in the sense of the word, even though I'm writing about history and illustrating it, because I haven't had the due diligence experience of, say, John Meacham or Doris Kearns Goodwin and some of these other historians who I actually look up to. But again, I like to write, record, take down notes, information, and then just bring it out there in a way that I do. I have to step back sometimes, because if you spend all day talking about climate change or talking about racism in the United States and all these things, what James Baldwin once said, to be black and relatively conscious in America is be in a state of rage all the time. Baldwin said that once. So when I step back and I try to get to a place where it's less strenuous and as upsetting, that's when I start going back to my childhood growing up in Grove Hall with my siblings and my mom and my dad and everyone, and the things that I remember. So when you look at the scrolls in its entirety, you may go, wow, he did this thing on Dick Cheney and George Bush, and he did this, this, and this. Why is the banana splits in here? Or why is Chuck Woolery from the Gong Show on here, and you got Mr. Spock over here, and you got Ric Flair, the wrestler, over here. So then you go, okay, he must be de-escalating. Or he's thinking about other things in a broader context of pop culture and all these other things. One of my favorite pop culture artists has always been Andy Warhol, and his style of doing things in that way. And part of the reason I was a fan is because I saw him on an episode of The Love Boat years ago as a guest star, and I saw him at WrestleMania 4, and I was like, I want to be that kind of artist where we can do anything we want versus being rigid and formal about the world of art. And so when you see these things in their entirety, I make detours at some point because you have to de-escalate.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what you add for us is this multi-dimensional space that artists can occupy. Mm-hmm. And in so doing, the sky's the limit in terms of how you can share your experience and your views with us. Mm-hmm. And in that vein, as we think about you as not only an AMARP artist, and AMARP means African American Master Artist in Residency Program, started
Blessed
by...
to be a part. Dana Chandler.
Dana Chandler.
He grandfathered me in. blessed to be a part.
Yes, and I also. So we're both AMARP artists, and I think that that has its realm of being able to give you a format and a platform to share your work. As a teacher, what would you like the impact of your voice and your art to have not only on your audience, but on your students?
Well, in Hopkinton, someone asked me a similar question during my artist talk, and the one thing I was very careful to say is, I don't proselytize. Now, there's a teacher there named Chris Herbert who teaches a class on race, and once a semester, he will invite me to come and give a slideshow about my work. So it's a slide presentation about who I am and my work, and a number of the kids of color and MECO students and what have you are there for it. I try not to proselytize, and the reason why is because I got hired to teach drawing and painting. I didn't get hired to have a political agenda, and that's a slippery slope. If I were a Trump lover and pro-life and anti-whatever, and I was like, well, I got a right to say some stuff too, then it becomes a mess. So I try not to. But if you want to come talk to me during lunch when I'm in my classroom and it's not class time and you want to ask questions and you want to have that kind of conversation, I'm open for it. But I wouldn't impose it in a classroom because that's not what I was hired for. So I'm very, very cautious of that. And it doesn't take a lot to have some disgruntled parents going, aha, we got him, you know.
Well, I want to thank you for such a candid conversation and your ability to share with us what inspires you and how you do your work and what is really consciously with you and significant to you and what matters. And so with that, I just want to know where we might view your art in the future, where you'd like to direct us to, and hope that you participate in the Bay State Banner Art Gallery.
I would be honored, absolutely honored. I can be seen on, if you just go to YouTube, Shea Justice, if you want to see the scroll project in process, my friend Lee Weinstein did a great video of this original, of this part. This was Hope and Change 2008. So you can go there and just look me up, Shea Justice Art. You can look, if you just Google my name, but mostly I can be found at Facebook on there and contact information and things like that. And I'm a member of the AMARC group on Facebook, which I encourage everyone to join because I always make sure we put interesting things up there for events, videos of stuff about our history that people may not know and stuff like that. So those are my ways. As I end, because obviously we're going to end the conversation, I also wanted to remark, a lot of this wouldn't have been possible also if it wasn't for obviously Dana Chandler, the wonderful artist in AMARC, but my family. Even though my last name is Justice, I was raised Mason. The Mason family has been a source of inspiration, ideas for me my entire life. I'm talking aunts, uncles, cousins, great aunts, great uncles, little cousins and everything. They get me going and they get me motivated. And it's always important for me to make sure I represent with that.
Wonderful. Thank you for highlighting your legacy and the shoulders you stand on. And it has been my extreme pleasure to have this conversation with you and to let people know who you are and that you are even still improving your skills as you go on in an urban sketchers art group that meets regularly on Sundays. So I just think that this is phenomenal, the work that you're doing, and we want to ask you to continue it.
I absolutely will. Thank you.